High up in the Colorado mountains, where the air was thin and the nearest neighbor lived a day's ride away, stood a small log cabin that most folks avoided. It wasn't haunted or cursed, but the woman who lived there might as well have put up a sign saying, "Stay away." Her name was Rebecca, and at 28 years old she had earned quite a reputation throughout the territory. Every traveling merchant, every cowboy looking for work, every settler passing through the area knew her story. She was the woman who said no to every man who ever tried to court her. The cabin sat perched on a rocky ledge, surrounded by tall pine trees that creaked and swayed in the mountain winds. Rebecca had chosen this place carefully 3 years ago when she fled from Denver. It was remote enough that unwanted visitors were rare, but close enough to the main trail that she could trade with the occasional traveler for supplies she couldn't make herself. She had arrived in the mountains with nothing but a small bag of belongings and a fierce determination never to depend on anyone again. The cabin had been abandoned for years when she claimed it. The roof leaked, the windows were broken, and wild animals had made themselves at home inside, but Rebecca saw potential where others saw ruin. Working from dawn to dusk, she patched the roof with pine bark and clay. She replaced the broken glass with oiled paper that let in light while keeping out the wind. She built new furniture from fallen trees and rocks she gathered from the mountainside. Every nail, every board, every improvement was her own work. When people asked why she insisted on doing everything herself, she would simply say she preferred it that way. The truth was more complicated. 3 years ago, Rebecca had been a school teacher in Denver, engaged to marry the son of a wealthy banker. She had thought herself lucky to catch the attention of such an important family. But behind closed doors, her intended husband showed his true nature. He was cruel, controlling, and quick to anger. When Rebecca tried to break off the engagement, his family threatened to ruin her reputation and ensure she never worked as a teacher again. So she ran. In the middle of the night, she packed what little she could carry and disappeared into the wilderness. She would rather face mountain lions and bitter winters than spend her life trapped in a marriage that would slowly destroy her spirit. The early months in the mountains were harder than anything she could have imagined. She learned to hunt small game with snares and traps. She discovered which wild plants were safe to eat and which ones would make her sick. When winter came, she nearly starved. But somehow, she survived. By her second year, Rebecca had established a routine that kept her busy and self-sufficient. She took in sewing work from the wives in the nearest town, 15 miles down the mountain. Her stitching was neat and quick, and word spread that she could mend anything from torn shirts to fancy dresses. She also preserved fruits and vegetables that she sold to travelers who passed through the mountain pass. But it was her refusal of male company that really made her famous throughout the territory. Men would ride up to her cabin with flowers, gifts, or smooth words about how a woman shouldn't live alone in such a dangerous place. Rebecca would thank them politely and send them on their way. When they persisted, she would show them the rifle she kept by her door and explain that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. There was Tom the blacksmith, who brought her iron nails and horseshoes, thinking practical gifts would win her over. She accepted the supplies but sent him away with payment and nothing more. There was Pete the cattle driver, who claimed he just wanted to check on her safety during his routes through the mountains. She assured him she was fine and suggested he not waste his time with unnecessary visits. The rejection that became most famous was of Robert, the wealthy rancher from the next valley over. He arrived at her cabin one spring morning with a dozen men, a wagon full of expensive gifts, and a proposal of marriage. He announced that he had decided she would make him a suitable wife and that he was prepared to overlook her wild phase in the mountains. Rebecca listened to his entire speech without saying a word. When he finished, she walked into her cabin and returned with a pot of cold coffee, which she poured over his head in front of all his men. She told him that if he ever set foot on her land again, she would shoot him for trespassing. The story spread like wildfire, and from that day forward Robert warned other men to stay away from that crazy woman in the mountains. But Rebecca wasn't crazy. She was careful. Every rejection, every wall she built around herself, was protection against the kind of pain and helplessness she had felt in Denver. She had learned that men could be charming and kind until they got what they wanted. Then they showed their true faces. Her days followed a predictable pattern that brought her comfort. She woke with the sunrise and spent the morning hours working in her small garden, where she grew vegetables and herbs. The afternoons were for sewing or preserving food. In the evenings, she would read by candlelight, working her way through the small collection of books she had managed to save from her teaching days. She talked to herself often, carrying on conversations with her chickens or addressing comments to the mountain peaks that surrounded her valley. It helped fill the silence and made her feel less alone. Sometimes she would catch herself preparing tea for two people out of old habit, then laugh at herself for the mistake. The loneliness was hardest during the long winter months when snow blocked the mountain passes and she wouldn't see another human face for weeks at a time. During those dark months, she would sometimes wonder if she had made the right choice. But then spring would come, and with it would come men trying to convince her that she needed a husband to be happy. These encounters always reminded her why she had chosen solitude in the first place. Rebecca had convinced herself that she was content with her life. She had freedom, independence, and safety. She answered to no one and could make her own choices about everything from what to eat for breakfast to how to spend her days. If the price of that freedom was loneliness, she told herself it was a fair trade. She had built her reputation as the untouchable woman so carefully that even she began to believe it was her true nature. She would tell herself that she simply wasn't the kind of woman who needed a man in her life. Some people were meant for marriage and families, and others were meant to walk through life alone. She had accepted that she was one of the latter. But late at night, when the wind howled through the pine trees and the cabin felt too small and too empty, Rebecca sometimes found herself wondering what it would be like to have someone to talk to. Someone who would listen to her thoughts and share their own. Someone who would help her carry the heavy water buckets or hold the ladder steady when she needed to clean the chimney. These thoughts scared her more than any wild animal or mountain storm. They meant that despite all her careful walls and fierce independence, part of her still longed for human connection. And that longing felt like a weakness she couldn't afford. So she would push these thoughts away and remind herself of all the reasons why she was better off alone. She was safe, she was free, she was strong, and no man would ever have power over her again. This was the life Rebecca had built for herself in the mountains, a life of solitude, self-reliance, and carefully maintained distance from anything that might hurt her. It was a life she had chosen, and she told herself every day that she was happy with that choice. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. The storm that would change everything started as just another autumn day in the Colorado mountains. Rebecca woke that morning to clear skies and the kind of crisp air that made her grateful to be alive. She had no idea that by evening, her carefully ordered world would be turned completely upside down. Miles away, down in the valley, a man named Daniel was getting ready to drive a herd of cattle through the mountain passes. At 35, he had been working cattle drives for more than half his life. He knew these mountains like the back of his hand, or so he thought. Daniel owned a small ranch about 40 miles south, and every autumn he would buy cattle from the northern ranches and drive them home before winter set in. This particular drive had been going well until his luck ran out. Daniel was riding ahead of the herd, scouting the trail, when his horse stepped in a hidden hole and went down hard. The animal wasn't badly hurt, but it was limping and couldn't carry a rider safely over rough ground. Daniel had no choice but to send the herd on with his hired men while he looked for help. That's when the weather turned deadly. The storm came out of nowhere, the way mountain storms sometimes do. One minute Daniel was walking his limping horse along a familiar trail, and the next minute the world disappeared in a wall of white. The wind picked up so fast it nearly knocked him off his feet. Snow began falling so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Daniel had been in mountain storms before, but nothing like this. The temperature dropped so fast he could feel his fingers going numb even inside his gloves. His horse was shivering and stumbling, clearly in pain from its injured leg. They needed shelter, and they needed it fast. For what felt like hours, Daniel struggled through the blinding snow, leading his horse and praying he was going in the right direction. He had lost the trail completely and was just hoping to stumble across some kind of shelter before they both froze to death. His face was raw from the wind and ice was forming in his beard and eyebrows. Just when he was starting to think they wouldn't make it, he saw something that looked like heaven itself, smoke rising from a chimney somewhere ahead. Daniel pushed through the snow toward that precious sign of life, pulling his reluctant horse behind him. The cabin appeared through the storm like something from a dream. It was small but sturdy, with warm yellow light glowing in the windows. Daniel had never been so happy to see a building in his entire life. He stumbled up to the door and pounded on it with his fist, shouting over the wind, "Please, I need help. My horse is hurt and we're caught in the storm." The door opened just a crack, and Daniel found himself looking into the most startling green eyes he had ever seen. They belonged to a woman with long brown hair and a face that might have been beautiful if it hadn't been set in such a hard expression. She was holding a rifle and it was pointed directly at his chest. "You need to move along, mister," she said in a voice as cold as the storm behind him. "I don't take in strangers." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for charity. I can pay for shelter, but my horse is injured and this storm will kill us both if we don't get inside somewhere." "There's a town 15 miles down the mountain," Rebecca replied, though she didn't lower the rifle. "You can make it if you start now." "In this storm, lady? I can't even see my own hand in front of my face, and my horse can barely walk." Daniel was getting desperate. He could feel the cold seeping through his heavy coat, and his horse was making soft sounds of pain behind him. "Please, I'm begging you, just until the storm passes." Rebecca looked past him at the limping horse, and Daniel saw something flicker in her expression. But when she looked back at him, her face was hard again. "I said no. Find somewhere else." She started to close the door, but just then a massive gust of wind hit the cabin so hard that the whole building shook. One of the shutters tore loose and went flying into the darkness. Daniel's horse stumbled and nearly fell, letting out a cry of pain that carried even over the howling wind. Rebecca stared at the injured animal for a long moment. Daniel could see her fighting with herself and he held his breath. Finally, she stepped back from the door. "You can come in," she said reluctantly. "But there are rules. You sleep by the fire, nowhere else. You keep your hands to yourself and your mouth shut. And the minute this storm ends, you're gone, understood?" "Yes, ma'am. Understood completely." Daniel was so relieved he would have agreed to just about anything. Rebecca helped him get his horse into a small shed attached to the cabin. The animal was clearly grateful to be out of the storm, even though it was still shivering. Rebecca surprised Daniel by knowing exactly how to examine the horse's injured leg. Her hands were gentle but sure as she felt for breaks or serious damage. "It's not broken," she announced. "Just a bad sprain. Keep him quiet and warm and he should be fine in a few days." "Thank you," Daniel said, and he meant it. "I'm Daniel, by the way. Daniel Cooper." Rebecca didn't offer her own name in return. Instead, she just nodded toward the cabin door. "Come on, you're letting all the heat out." The inside of the cabin was smaller than Daniel had expected, but it was warm and clean and felt like paradise after the storm outside. There was a stone fireplace with a good fire burning, a small table and 2 chairs and a bed in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, sewing supplies, and preserved foods in glass jars. "You can sit by the fire," Rebecca said, pointing to a spot on the floor near the hearth. "I'll get you some coffee." She moved around the small space with efficient grace, heating coffee on the wood stove and setting out a plate of bread and cold meat. Daniel noticed that she kept her distance from him, never coming closer than necessary. When she handed him the coffee, she was careful not to let their fingers touch. "This is very kind of you," Daniel said, wrapping his cold hands around the warm cup. "I know you didn't want to let me in." "I don't like strangers," Rebecca replied bluntly. "Men especially. They always want something." "I just want to get warm and wait out the storm," Daniel assured her. "Nothing more." Rebecca looked at him suspiciously, as if she didn't quite believe him. She sat down in one of the chairs, keeping the table between them. Even sitting, she held herself stiffly, like she was ready to run or fight at any moment. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind was howling like a living thing, and Daniel could hear tree branches scraping against the roof. Snow was piling up against the windows so thick it blocked out most of the light, even though it was still afternoon. "How long do storms like this usually last?" Daniel asked. "Could be hours, could be days." Rebecca's voice didn't give anything away. "Depends on how angry the mountain is feeling." Daniel nodded, though privately he hoped it would be hours rather than days. The cabin was warm and comfortable, but the tension between him and his reluctant hostess was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rebecca watched his every move like she expected him to suddenly turn dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel tried to make conversation, but Rebecca answered his questions with as few words as possible. She asked him nothing about himself, showed no curiosity about where he had come from or where he was going. It was clear she wanted him gone as soon as possible, but the storm had other plans. By evening, it was clear they were dealing with something serious. The wind was so strong it was making the cabin walls creak, and snow was coming down so hard it looked like a solid white curtain outside the windows. "Looks like we're stuck for a while," Daniel said, stating the obvious. Rebecca just nodded grimly. She prepared a simple dinner of soup and biscuits, serving Daniel his portion without comment. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the roar of the storm outside. When it came time to sleep, Rebecca made her position very clear. She pointed to a spot by the fireplace where she had laid out some blankets. "That's your bed. Stay there. If you move from that spot for any reason other than going outside to see to your horse, I'll shoot you. Are we clear?" "Yes, ma'am, crystal clear." Rebecca disappeared behind a blanket she had hung across one corner of the cabin, creating a small private area around her bed. Daniel could hear her moving around, getting ready for sleep, but he kept his eyes fixed on the fire and tried not to think about the fact that he was sharing a small space with a woman he found more intriguing by the hour. As he lay on the hard floor, listening to the storm rage outside, Daniel found himself wondering about his mysterious hostess. What had made her so afraid of men? Why did she live all alone in this remote cabin? And why did she look at him sometimes like she expected him to hurt her? He had a feeling this storm was going to last longer than either of them wanted, and he had no idea how much everything was about to change for both of them. The storm that had started as an overnight inconvenience stretched into its second day, then its third. What neither Rebecca nor Daniel had expected was how being trapped together would slowly begin to change both of them. Daniel woke on the second morning to find Rebecca already up, quietly preparing breakfast. She had dark circles under her eyes, and he suspected she hadn't slept well. He couldn't blame her. Having a strange man in her safe space had to be difficult for someone who valued her privacy as much as she clearly did. "Morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She nodded without turning around. "Coffee's ready. We're running low on firewood. The shed's almost empty." Daniel sat up, immediately alert. "I can chop more. Where do you keep your axe?" For the first time since he'd arrived, Rebecca looked directly at him. There was surprise in her green eyes, as if the offer to help was unexpected. "You don't need to do that," she said carefully. "Ma'am, I'm eating your food and using your firewood. The least I can do is help maintain what's keeping us alive." Daniel stood and stretched, working out the kinks from sleeping on the hard floor. "Besides, I'm not much good at sitting still." Rebecca hesitated for a long moment, then nodded toward a corner of the cabin. "Axe is over there, but the woodpile is buried under 3 feet of snow." "Then I guess I'll be doing some digging too." Daniel spent most of that day outside, despite the continuing storm. He dug out the woodpile, chopped enough logs to last several more days, and checked on his horse. The animal was doing better, able to put some weight on the injured leg, but it was clear they wouldn't be traveling anywhere soon. When he came, back inside covered in snow and breathing hard from the work, he found that Rebecca had prepared a hot meal and set it on the table. She was still keeping her distance, but something in her posture seemed slightly less rigid. "Thank you," she said quietly as he sat down to eat. "For the wood." "Thank you for the food and shelter," Daniel replied. and for taking care of my horse. You clearly know your way around animals. I have to. Can't afford to pay someone else to do it. Rebecca's voice was matter-of-fact, but Daniel caught something else underneath. Pride, maybe, or determination. You built all this yourself? He gestured around the cabin. Most of it. Had some help with the roof, but that's all. Daniel looked around with new appreciation. The cabin was small but well built, with tight joints and straight lines. Everything was neat and functional, from the handmade furniture to the carefully organized shelves. That's impressive work, he said honestly. Most men couldn't have done better. Rebecca's head snapped up, and for a moment Daniel thought he had offended her, but then he saw that she was studying his face, as if looking for signs that he was making fun of her. You mean that? She said finally, and it wasn't a question. I do. I've built plenty of buildings in my time, and this is solid craftsmanship. Something shifted in Rebecca's expression. It wasn't exactly warmth, but the ice. In her eyes thawed just a little. By the third day, they had settled into an unexpected routine. Daniel would wake early and tend to the fire, check on his horse, and do whatever outdoor work needed doing despite the continuing storm. Rebecca would prepare meals and work on her sewing, creating neat stitches in torn clothing that people from town had brought her. They began to talk more, though Rebecca was still careful about what she revealed. Daniel learned that she had been a teacher before coming to the mountains, that she could read Latin and French as well as English, and that she had strong opinions about everything from politics to the proper way to preserve vegetables. Daniel, for his part, found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about his ranch, about the cattle drives that took him all over the territory, about his dreams of expanding his land and maybe raising horses instead of cattle someday. Why horses? Rebecca asked one evening as they sat by the fire. They're smarter than cattle, Daniel said, poking at the fire with a stick. More personality. A good horse is like a partner, not just livestock. Like your horse out there. What's his name? Thunder. Had him for 6 years now. He's getting older, but he's still the best horse I've ever owned. Daniel glanced toward the door, where they could hear the wind still howling. I was scared I was going to lose him in this storm. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you didn't, she said softly. It was the kindest thing she had said to him since he'd arrived, and Daniel felt something warm settle in his chest. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. He was beginning to understand that Rebecca's kindness was rare and precious, given out carefully to those who earned it. On the fourth morning, disaster struck in a new way. Daniel woke to the sound of cracking wood and a tremendous crash. A massive pine tree, weighted down with snow and battered by the wind, had finally given up and fallen directly onto the cabin roof. The tree punched a hole clear through the roof in the corner where Rebecca slept. Snow and pine needles poured into the cabin, along with freezing wind that quickly began to drop the temperature inside. We need to patch that hole right now, Daniel said, jumping into action, or we'll freeze to death before morning. Working together, they managed to get a canvas tarp over the worst of the hole and secure it with rope and nails. But the damage was significant, and cold air was still seeping in around the edges of their makeshift repair. My bed's soaked, Rebecca said, staring at the pile of wet blankets and the puddle of melted snow where she had been sleeping just hours before. Daniel looked at the ruined corner, then at the fireplace on the other side of the small cabin. There was only one solution, and they both knew it. You'll have to sleep by the fire, he said carefully. With me. Rebecca's face went white. No, I'll find another way. There is no other way. Look at this place. Daniel gestured around the cabin. Half of it was now too cold to be habitable, and the fire was the only source of warmth left. We'll both freeze if we don't share body heat. I said no. Rebecca's voice was sharp with panic. Daniel held up his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm not suggesting anything improper. We'll each have our own blankets. I'll stay on my side, you stay on yours. But that corner is uninhabitable now, and this storm isn't over yet. Rebecca stared at the destroyed corner of her cabin, then at the fire, then at Daniel. He could see the war going on in her mind. Her need for safety was fighting with her fear of trusting a man, any man, even one who had been nothing but respectful. For 4 days. "I'll keep my clothes on," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. And you'll stay on your side. I give you my word." That night they lay awkwardly side by side on the floor near the fireplace, each wrapped in their own blankets, but close enough that Daniel could hear Rebecca's breathing. She was tense as a wire, and he knew she wasn't sleeping. "Rebecca," he said softly into the darkness. "Yes? Thank you for trusting me enough to let me stay here. I know it's not easy for you." She was quiet for so long he thought she had fallen asleep. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "My name's not Rebecca." Daniel turned his head toward her in the darkness. "What?" "My name's not Rebecca. It's Beth. Elizabeth. But everyone used to call me Beth." It was the first truly personal thing she had told him, and Daniel understood the significance of the gift. She was telling him her real name, her true self, not the identity she had created to keep people at arm's length. "Beth," he repeated softly. "That's a pretty name." "I haven't told anyone my real name in 3 years," she whispered. "Why did you tell me?" Another long silence. Then, "I don't know." But Daniel thought he did know. Something was happening between them, something that scared her but that she couldn't quite resist. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crack, and he was honored to be trusted with even this small piece of who she really was. The 5th day dawned clearer. With the storm finally beginning to weaken, Daniel woke to find Beth already up, making coffee and trying to pretend that sharing sleeping space hadn't affected her. But he noticed that she didn't flinch away when he accidentally brushed her arm, reaching for his coffee cup. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. "Storm's breaking up," he observed, looking out the window. "Yes." Beth's voice was carefully neutral. "You'll be able to leave soon." Daniel felt something clench in his chest. Leave. Yes, that had been the plan all along. Wait out the storm, then go back to his life. But the thought of leaving Beth alone in this damaged cabin, of never seeing her again, was suddenly unbearable. "Beth," he started, then stopped. How could he put into words what these 5 days had meant to him? How could he explain that she had awakened something in him that he thought had died years ago? She looked at him expectantly, and he saw his own confusion, reflected in her green eyes. She felt it too, this connection between them. And like him, she didn't know what to do about it. The storm was ending, and soon they would have to decide what came next. But for now, they had one more day together in their small, damaged sanctuary. One more day to figure out whether the walls that were crumbling around Beth's heart could be rebuilt, or whether they would fall completely. The morning of the 6th day brought something Beth hadn't seen in nearly a week: sunshine. Golden rays streamed through the windows of the damaged cabin, making the ice crystals on the walls sparkle like diamonds. Outside, the world was buried, under feet of fresh snow, but the sky was a brilliant blue that promised clear weather ahead. Daniel stood at the window, drinking his coffee and testing his injured horse's weight on the hurt leg. Thunder was moving much better, able to walk, without limping. In another day or two, they would be able to travel safely. Beth watched Daniel from across the cabin, and her heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. For 6 days, she had been telling herself that this was temporary, that once the storm ended, things would go back to the way they were before. She would be alone again, safe in her solitude, protected from the pain that came with caring about another person. But somewhere during those 6 days, Daniel had become more than just a stranger seeking shelter. He had become the first man she had trusted in 3 years. The first person who had seen her real self and hadn't tried to change her or control her. And now he was going to leave. "Looks like the weather's clearing up," Daniel said, though his voice didn't sound as happy as it should have. "Yes," Beth replied, her own voice carefully steady. "You'll be able to get back to your ranch soon." Daniel turned away from the window and looked at her. Really looked at her, as if he was trying to memorize her face. The silence between them was heavy with things neither of them seemed able to say. Finally, Daniel set down his coffee cup and walked over to where Beth was sitting at the table, mending a torn shirt. "Beth," he said softly, "come with me." The needle slipped in her fingers, pricking her thumb. A small drop of blood appeared, and she stuck her thumb in her mouth to stop the bleeding. It gave her a moment to think, to process what he had just said. "What?" she whispered. "Come with me to my ranch. You could teach the children in my area. There's a town about 10 miles from my place, and they've been looking for a teacher for years. You could have your own little house, your own life, but you wouldn't have to be alone anymore." Beth stared at him, her heart racing. The offer was everything she hadn't dared to dream of. A chance to teach again. A chance to be near Daniel. A chance to be part of the world instead of hiding from it. But it was also everything that terrified her most. "I can't," she said, her voice barely audible. "Why not?" Beth stood up abruptly, walking to the other side of the small cabin as if distance could protect her from the hope and fear battling in her chest. "Because I can't depend on you," she said, her back to him. "Or anyone. I learned that lesson once, and I'm not going through it again." "This isn't about depending on me," Daniel said gently. "This is about building a life together, as equals." Beth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "As equals? Daniel, you're a man with land and cattle and a place in the world. I'm a woman with nothing but the clothes on my back and a damaged cabin. We're not equals, and we never could be. You're wrong." Daniel's voice was firm. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You've built a life from nothing, survived on your own in one of the harshest places on earth, and you've done it all, without compromising who you are. If anything, you're stronger than I am." Beth turned around and Daniel saw tears glittering in her green eyes. "You don't understand. You can't understand. Men always start out saying the right things. They promise you equality and respect and love. But once they have you, once you depend on them, everything changes." "What happened to you, Beth?" Daniel asked quietly. "Who hurt you so badly that you think all men are the same?" For a moment, Beth looked like she might tell him. Her mouth opened, and Daniel could see her struggling with the words. But then she closed her eyes and shook her head. "It doesn't matter. The past is the past. What matters is that I know better now. So you're just going to stay here, alone, for the rest of your life?" "Yes." Beth's voice was getting stronger, more determined. "I'm going to repair this cabin, and I'm going to keep living the way I always have. It's a good life. A safe life. It's not a life at all," Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's existing. It's hiding. You're so scared of getting hurt that you're not letting yourself live." Beth's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare judge my choices. You don't know what it's like to have someone you trust turn into someone you fear. You don't know what it's like to realize that the person who promised to love you forever is actually planning to lock you away and control every aspect of your life." The words hung in the air between them, and Daniel finally understood. Beth hadn't just been hurt by a man. She had been engaged to someone who had shown his true controlling nature only after she was trapped, someone who had made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. "I'm not him," Daniel said softly. "I know that." Beth's voice broke a little. "That's what makes this so hard. If you were like him, it would be easy to say no. But you're kind and respectful and I think I could fall in love with you. And that terrifies me more than anything." Daniel felt his heart leap at her words, even as he saw the pain in her face. She did care for him, but that caring was exactly what she was running from. "Beth, love isn't supposed to terrify you. Real love, healthy love, should make you feel safe and supported, not trapped." "How do I know the difference?" Beth asked desperately. "How do I know that what I'm feeling is real and not just loneliness making me stupid?" Daniel wanted more than anything to cross the cabin and take her in his arms, to hold her until her fears melted away. But he knew that would be the worst thing he could do. Beth needed to make her own choice, without pressure from him. I guess. You don't know for certain, he said honestly. Love always involves risk. But Beth, so does living alone for the rest of your life. What if you're wrong? What if you're passing up the chance for real happiness because you're so afraid of being hurt again? Beth was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to stop being afraid. You don't have to stop being afraid. You just have to decide that some things are worth being afraid for. They stood there looking at each other across the small cabin, both of them crying, both of them knowing that this conversation was changing everything between them. I need time to think, Beth said finally. Daniel nodded. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere today. Thunder still needs another day of rest before we travel. But even as he said it, they both knew that time was running out. Tomorrow, or the day after at the latest, Daniel would have to leave. He had his own life to get back to, his own responsibilities, waiting for him. That night, they lay side by side near the fire one last time, both pretending to sleep while actually staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had been said. Beth found herself memorizing the sound of Daniel's breathing, the warmth of his presence beside her. Tomorrow night, she would be alone again. The thought made her chest ache with a pain she hadn't felt in years. Daniel, for his part, was trying to figure out how he was going to leave her. 6 days ago, he had been a contented bachelor, satisfied with his solitary life on the ranch. Now the thought of going back to that empty house, of eating meals alone and talking only to his horses, seemed unbearable. But what choice did he have? He couldn't force Beth to trust him. He couldn't make her believe that he was different from the man who had hurt her before. All he could do was offer her his heart and hope that she was brave enough to take it. Morning came too soon, bringing with it clear skies and the sound of melting snow dripping from the roof. Daniel's horse was moving well, eager to be back on the trail. There was no reason to delay any longer. As Daniel packed his few belongings and saddled Thunder, Beth stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching him prepare to leave her life forever. She had made her decision during the long, sleepless night, but saying it out loud was the hardest thing she had ever done. Daniel, she called out just as he was about to mount his horse. He turned to look at her, hope and heartbreak warring in his brown eyes. I can't come with you, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I'm sorry, but I can't. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected this, but had hoped to be wrong. He walked back to where she stood and stopped just in front of her, close enough to touch but careful not to overstep her boundaries. I understand, he said quietly. But Beth, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. My ranch is in Cedar Valley, about 40 miles southeast of here. Anyone in the area can give you directions. I won't change my mind, Beth said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe not. But if you do, I'll be waiting. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden horse. I made this for you last night, so you'll have something to remember me by. Beth took the little horse, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. It was beautiful work, detailed and delicate. She could see the hours of careful carving that had gone into it. It's beautiful, she whispered. Like you. For a moment they just stood there, drinking in their last moments together. Then Daniel leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle as a butterfly's wing. Goodbye, Beth. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, Daniel. Beth watched from the doorway as Daniel mounted Thunder and rode away down the mountain path. She stood there. Winter in the mountains had always been hard, but the months following Daniel's departure were the longest and darkest Beth had ever experienced. She threw herself into repairing the damage from the storm, working from dawn to dusk to patch the roof and restore her cabin to its former state. But no amount of physical work could fill the emptiness that had settled in her heart. Every evening, as she sat alone by the fire, Beth would take out the small wooden horse Daniel had carved for her. She would run her fingers over its smooth surface and remember the sound of his laughter, the gentle way he had spoken to her, the safety she had felt sleeping beside him during the storm. Those memories were both a comfort and a torture. The loneliness was different now. Before Daniel, Beth had been content with her solitude because she had never known what she was missing. But now she knew what it felt like to share meals with someone who listened to her thoughts, to have help with the heavy work around the cabin, to fall asleep feeling protected and cared for. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt suffocating. As winter deepened, Beth found herself talking out loud more often, carrying on conversations with Daniel as if he were still there. She would tell him about her day, ask his opinion on things, even argue with his imagined responses. She knew she was being foolish, but it was the only way to keep from going completely mad with loneliness. The worst part was the nights. Beth had moved her bed back to its original corner after repairing the roof, but she couldn't sleep there anymore. Every night she found herself making a bed by the fireplace, in the exact spot where she and Daniel had slept side by side. She would lie there in the dark, reaching out to touch the empty space beside her, wishing desperately that she had been brave enough to go with him. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a decision Beth had been avoiding for months. She was standing in her garden, planting the same vegetables she had grown for 3 years, when she suddenly stopped and looked around at her small, neat world. This was her life. This was what she had chosen. And for the first time, she admitted to herself that she was miserable. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that safety and independence were worth any price, even loneliness. But now she understood that she hadn't been living at all. She had been hiding, letting fear make all her decisions for her. Beth sat down hard on the ground, her hands covered in dirt, and finally let herself cry for everything she had lost. She cried for the young woman who had been so eager to marry and start a family. She cried for the 3 years she had wasted hiding in the mountains. And most of all, she cried for Daniel, the good man she had sent away because she was too afraid to trust her own heart. When the tears finally stopped, Beth felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. She knew what she had to do, and for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. The next morning, Beth began making preparations for a journey. She packed her few valuable possessions, arranged for a neighbor to look after her chickens, and cleaned the cabin one last time. She left a note for anyone who might come looking for her, explaining that she had gone to start a new life and would not be returning. As she locked the cabin door and turned to leave, Beth felt a mixture of fear and excitement that made her feel more alive than she had in years. She was taking the biggest risk of her life, but she finally understood that the biggest risk would have been staying. The journey to Cedar Valley took her 3 days on foot, following the mountain trails and asking directions from other travelers. With each mile, Beth felt her confidence growing. She had survived 3 years alone in the wilderness. She had built a home with her own hands and made a living from nothing. She was strong enough to face whatever came next. When she finally reached the valley where Daniel lived, Beth was amazed by what she saw. Rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with cattle and horses. A small town nestled at the base of the mountains, with a church steeple and neat wooden buildings that looked prosperous and welcoming. Daniel's ranch was exactly as he had described it. A large wooden house surrounded by barns and corrals with horses grazing in the nearby pastures. Beth stood at the edge of his property for a long time, watching the activity around the buildings and trying to work up the courage to walk up to the front door. What if he had changed his mind? What if he was angry with her for taking so long to decide? What if he had found someone else during the months she had been hiding in her mountain cabin? These fears might have sent the old Beth running back to her safe solitude, but she was no longer the woman who had sent Daniel away. She had learned something important during those long, lonely months. Running away from fear didn't make it disappear. It just made life smaller and sadder. Taking a deep breath, Beth walked up the path to Daniel's front door and knocked. The door opened, and there he was. Daniel looked exactly the same as she remembered, but his brown eyes widened in shock when he saw her standing on his doorstep. Beth? He said her name like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Hello, Daniel. Beth's voice was steady, though her heart was racing. I was wondering if that job offer was still available. For a moment, Daniel just stared at her. Then a smile slowly spread across his face. the most beautiful smile Beth had ever seen. "The teaching job?" he asked. "That one too," Beth said, meeting his eyes directly. "But I was thinking more about the other offer, the one about building a life together." Daniel stepped out of the house and moved closer to her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because Beth, I won't survive having you leave again." Beth reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden horse he had carved for her. She had carried it with her every day since he left, and it showed the wear of being handled so often. "I've been carrying this with me for 6 months," she said. "It reminded me every day of what I was too afraid to take. But I'm not that frightened woman anymore, Daniel. I know who I am, and I know what I want. And what I want is you." Daniel closed the distance between them and gently took her face in his hands. "What changed your mind?" "I realized that I was so afraid of being hurt that I was guaranteeing I would be hurt, just in a different way." Beth leaned into his touch, feeling the rightness of it in every part of her being. "I spent 3 years protecting myself from pain, but I was miserable anyway. At least this way I have a chance at happiness." "You have more than a chance," Daniel said softly. "You have a promise." When he kissed her, Beth felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower in sunlight. This was what she had been afraid of, but also what she had been longing for without knowing it. This feeling of coming home to someone who would love and protect the real her, not try to change her into someone else. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," Daniel replied. "I have since about the 3rd day of that storm, when you told me your real name." Beth laughed, and it felt wonderful to laugh with pure joy instead of bitter irony. "What happens now?" "Now we build that life together," Daniel said, taking her hand. "But first, I want to show you the schoolhouse in town. The children there have been waiting for a teacher for almost a year now." As they walked hand in hand toward town, Beth felt a peace she had never experienced before. She had spent 3 years believing that independence and safety meant being alone, but now she understood the difference between being alone and being free. True freedom meant having the courage to open your heart to someone worthy of it. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building with large windows that let in plenty of light. Inside, there were neat rows of desks and a blackboard that had seen better days. Beth could already picture herself here, teaching children to read and write and think for themselves. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, watching her face. "I think those children are going to learn more than they bargained for," Beth said with a smile. "I plan to teach the girls that they can be anything they want to be, and the boys that real strength means treating others with respect. I wouldn't expect anything less from you." That evening, as they sat on Daniel's porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and pink, Beth reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had run away from Denver to escape one kind of life, hidden in the mountains to avoid another, and finally found the courage to choose the life she actually wanted. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked, as if he could read her thoughts. "Leaving your cabin, giving up that independence?" Beth considered the question seriously. "I'm not giving up my independence," she said finally. "I'm choosing to share it with someone I trust. There's a difference." "What if people talk?" "A woman, living alone for so long, then suddenly showing up with a man?" Beth laughed. "Daniel, I've been the subject of gossip for 3 years. People called me crazy, cursed, and worse. If they want to talk about me being happy instead of miserable, let them talk." Daniel reached over and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "So what's our story going to be? How did we meet?" "The truth," Beth said without hesitation. "A storm brought you to my door, and I was smart enough to let you in. Eventually, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Beth thought about all